Eleanor Briggs sat in her cramped Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by walls papered with printouts, photographs, and red string connecting dots that only she could see. The rain hammered against the windows with a relentless rhythm that matched the pounding in her head. It was 3 a.m, but sleep had become a stranger to her months ago. On her laptop screen glowed the face of Sarah Mendez, a 24-year-old graphic designer from Portland who had vanished without a trace 6 weeks earlier. The police called it a voluntary disappearance. Eleanor called it lazy work. She took a sip of cold coffee, grimacing at the bitterness, and clicked through the digital breadcrumbs Sarah had left behind. Social media posts that stopped abruptly, a bank account untouched. A car found abandoned near the Columbia River, with the keys still in the ignition. The official narrative was clean, convenient, forgettable. But Eleanor had learned long ago that the cleanest stories were often the dirtiest lies. Her phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. The name on the screen made her jaw tighten. Miles Carter. She hadn't spoken to him in 2 years, not since the Riverside case had blown up in both their faces. He'd lost his badge. She'd lost her reputation. Their last conversation had ended with slammed doors and accusations that still echoed in her memory. Eleanor. His voice was rougher than she remembered, worn down by cigarettes and sleepless nights. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to show you something. It's about the cases you've been tracking. She felt her pulse quicken despite herself. I'm not interested in whatever theory you're peddling, Miles. I work alone now. The Mendez disappearance isn't isolated, he continued, ignoring her dismissal. There are 4 others in the past 8 months. Different cities, different demographics, but the pattern is there if you know where to look. I've been compiling data. And Eleanor, someone is watching these investigations, someone with resources we can't begin to understand. Eleanor's eyes drifted back to her wall of evidence. She had suspected connections, but hearing Miles confirm her instincts sent a chill down her spine. What kind of resources? The kind that can scrub security footage, alter digital footprints, and make witnesses change their stories overnight. Meet me tomorrow. Please. You need to see this. She hung up without answering, but they both knew she would go. The journalist in her couldn't resist a story this big, and the broken woman inside her needed to prove that she could still uncover truth in a world drowning in manufactured narratives. The next afternoon, Eleanor found herself in a diner in Queens, the kind of anonymous place where nobody asked questions, and the coffee was just as terrible as what she made at home. Miles was already there, seated in a corner booth with his back to the wall, old habits dying hard. He looked older, grayer, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. The confident FBI agent she'd once known had been replaced by something harder and more desperate. You look like hell, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Takes one to know one. He pushed a thick manila folder across the table. Before you open that, you need to understand something. If we go down this road, there's no turning back. The people behind this, they don't just silence investigations. They erase them, and everyone connected to them. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the folder. You're being paranoid. Am I? Miles leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 2 detectives who worked the Philadelphia case both died in unrelated accidents within 3 weeks of each other. A journalist in Seattle who was asking the wrong questions had a complete mental breakdown and is now institutionalized. These aren't coincidences, Eleanor. This is systematic elimination. She opened the folder anyway, because she always did. Inside were case files, photographs, timelines meticulously constructed with the precision that had made Miles one of the Bureau's best analysts before everything fell apart. Sarah Mendez was there, but so were others. Marcus Chen, a software engineer from San Francisco. Layla Johnson, a nurse from Miami. David Kowalski, a teacher from Chicago. Emma Rodriguez, a lawyer from Dallas. All between 23 and 32 years old. All disappeared with minimal evidence, all written off by local authorities as voluntary departures or cold cases not worth the resources. What connects them? Eleanor asked, her journalist's instinct already cataloguing details, searching for the invisible thread. That's what we need to find out, but look at this. Miles pulled out his laptop and opened a program she didn't recognize. I've been using data mining algorithms to track unusual patterns in public records, news reports, social media. Every single one of these victims had some connection to investigative work, whistleblowing, or exposing corruption. Sarah Mendez was designing graphics for a non-profit investigating dark money in politics. Marcus Chen worked for a tech company and had just filed an internal complaint about data privacy violations. Layla Johnson was treating patients at a clinic that serviced undocumented immigrants and had witnessed something she reported to authorities. You see where this is going? Eleanor felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with piecing together a puzzle others couldn't see. Someone is targeting people who know too much or see too much. Exactly. And whoever is doing this has the capability to make people disappear so thoroughly that even their families eventually accept the official explanations. That kind of power isn't just money or connections. That's institutional reach. Government level, maybe higher. The diner suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Eleanor glanced around at the other patrons, the elderly couple sharing pie, the truck driver reading a newspaper, the waitress refilling coffee. Were any of them watching? Was she being paranoid, or had Miles's fear infected her already? Why come to me? She asked. You burned that bridge pretty thoroughly last time. Miles's expression softened with something that might have been regret. Because you're the only person I know who's stubborn enough to pursue this and smart enough to maybe survive it. And because I owe you the truth about Riverside. I was wrong, Eleanor. The evidence we followed, the witness testimony, it was all manufactured. I've spent 2 years going through everything, and I finally found proof. We were set up to fail, to discredit both of us before we could expose what was really happening. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications. Eleanor had suspected as much, but hearing Miles confirm it brought a surge of vindication mixed with anger at the time she'd lost, the credibility she'd sacrificed. Who set us up? I don't know yet, but I think it's connected to this, to whatever network is behind these disappearances. We got too close to something in Riverside, and they destroyed us before we could see it clearly. Eleanor closed the folder and met his eyes. If we do this, we do it my way. No FBI protocols, no playing by rules that don't apply anymore. We document everything, we stay mobile, and we trust no one outside this booth. Agreed. Miles extended his hand across the table. She shook it, feeling the weight of a decision that would change everything. Outside, the grey January sky pressed down on New York City, and somewhere in America, people were vanishing into a silence so complete it was as if they had never existed at all. But Eleanor Briggs had made a career out of giving voice to the silenced, and she wasn't about to stop now, no matter how deep the darkness went or how many ghosts waited in its depths. The investigation began in earnest on a freezing February morning in Portland, Oregon. Eleanor had insisted they start with Sarah Mendez, the most recent disappearance, before the trail went completely cold. Miles had argued for establishing a broader pattern first, but Eleanor's instinct told her that fresh evidence was their best chance at finding something the sanitizers had missed. They compromised by agreeing to spend 1 week in each city, moving quickly, staying off the grid as much as possible, in an age where anonymity was becoming impossible. Portland greeted them with its characteristic drizzle and grey skies, the city wrapped in a dampness that seemed to seep into bones and spirits alike. They rented a nondescript sedan with cash and checked into a budget motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the clerk didn't bother looking at their fake IDs too closely. Eleanor had learned the art of invisibility during her years as an investigative journalist, how to blend into backgrounds and become forgettable. Miles, despite his years in law enforcement, had to relearn how to operate without the authority and resources of the bureau behind him. Sarah Mendez had lived in the Alberta Arts District, a neighborhood of colorful houses, independent coffee shops, and the kind of progressive community energy that had made Portland a magnet for creative professionals and activists. Her apartment was in a converted Victorian, painted teal and yellow, with a small front porch where winter-dead plants still sat in ceramic pots. Eleanor had contacted Sarah's roommate, Jessica Torres, under the guise of being a freelance journalist working on a piece about missing persons, a cover story close enough to the truth to be convincing. Jessica was 26, with purple-streaked hair and the kind of nervous energy that came from grief and unanswered questions. She let them into the apartment, which still bore signs of Sarah's presence. Art supplies scattered across a desk, concert posters on the walls, a half-finished mug of tea that Jessica admitted she couldn't bring herself to throw away. "The police barely spent 2 days investigating," Jessica said, her voice tight with frustration. "They found her car by the river, decided she'd probably jumped, and called it depression. But Sarah wasn't depressed. She was excited about her work, about the project she was doing for Citizens Against Corruption. She'd just told me she'd found something big in the graphics she was analyzing, some pattern in campaign finance data that nobody had noticed before." Eleanor pulled out her notebook, a physical one rather than digital, another precaution Miles had insisted on. "Did she tell you what the pattern was?" "Not specifically. She said it was complicated, something about shell companies and timing of donations that created a network of influence nobody was tracking. She was supposed to present her findings at a board meeting the week she disappeared." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "But her laptop is gone, her backup drives are gone, even the cloud storage she used was wiped clean. The police said she probably deleted everything herself before she left, but Sarah would never do that. That project was everything to her." Miles exchanged a glance with Eleanor, another data scrubbing, another convenient erasure of evidence. "Did anyone unusual contact her in the days before she disappeared? Strange phone calls, people following her, anything out of the ordinary?" Jessica hesitated, wrapping her arms around herself. "She did mention something weird about a week before. She said she felt like she was being watched, like someone was tracking her online activity. She even covered her laptop camera with tape, which I thought was paranoid at the time. And there was a guy who came by asking about her the day after she vanished, before I'd even reported her missing. He said he was with some kind of digital security firm. Wanted to know if Sarah had mentioned any concerns about data breaches or hacking. I didn't think much of it then, but now it seems wrong, you know." "How did he know to come looking so fast?" Eleanor felt the familiar tingle of a lead materializing. "Do you remember his name? What he looked like? He gave me a card, but I can't find it now. Tall guy, maybe 40, expensive suit, really polite but kind of cold. He had this way of asking questions that made it feel like he already knew the answers and was just testing me." Jessica moved to a desk drawer and rifled through papers. "I swear I kept that card, but it's like it just disappeared." They spent another hour interviewing Jessica, collecting details about Sarah's habits, her routines, her relationships. Everything pointed to a woman who was engaged with life, not someone planning to vanish or harm herself. As they left the apartment, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched, that invisible eyes were tracking their movements, cataloguing their questions, reporting back to whoever orchestrated these disappearances. That evening, they visited the site where Sarah's car had been found, a pullout near Cathedral Park overlooking the Willamette River. The area was beautiful in a melancholy way, the Gothic arches of St. John's Bridge rising into the mist, the river flowing dark and silent below. If someone wanted to stage a suicide, this would be the place. But Eleanor had covered enough real suicides to know the signs, and nothing about Sarah's case matched the profile. "No body was ever recovered," Miles said, standing at the railing where Sarah's car had been parked. "In this current, a body would typically surface within a few days, maybe travel downstream but still turn up. The fact that there's been nothing in 6 weeks is statistically improbable." Eleanor walked the perimeter, examining sight lines, access points, the logistics of making someone vanish from a semi-public location. So what's the alternative? Someone grabbed her here, forced her into another vehicle, or the car was placed here as misdirection, and she was taken somewhere else entirely. Miles pulled up security camera data on his tablet, another piece of information he'd acquired through channels Eleanor didn't ask about. There are 3 traffic cameras within a mile radius of this location. All 3 experienced simultaneous technical glitches during the 2-hour window when Sarah's car would have been driven here. City maintenance logs show no scheduled work, no reported problems, just blank footage where there should be recorded data. The pattern was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Eleanor photographed the scene from multiple angles, noting the location of streetlights, the distance from residential areas, the lack of witnesses. Whoever did this has serious technical capabilities, government level, like you said, or someone with access to government systems. There's a difference. Miles's phone buzzed, and his expression darkened as he read the message. We need to leave. Now. What's wrong? I set up monitoring alerts for any searches related to our names or the victims. Someone just ran a query on both of us through a private intelligence database, cross-referenced with Portland location data. They know we're here, Eleanor. They're looking for us. They moved quickly back to the car, Eleanor's heart pounding with a fear she tried to rationalize away as paranoia. But paranoia was just pattern recognition when you were actually being hunted. They drove in silence for 20 minutes, Miles taking random turns, doubling back, using evasive driving techniques to ensure they weren't followed. Only when he was satisfied they were clean did he pull into a crowded shopping center parking lot. We can't go back to the motel, he said. We need to assume everything is compromised. New location, new vehicle, new approach. Eleanor stared out at the ordinary people moving through their ordinary lives, shopping for groceries, loading purchases into cars, completely unaware of the invisible machinery operating around them. If they know we're investigating, why not just stop us directly? Why the cat and mouse game? Because direct action creates attention, evidence, questions. Their power comes from operating in the spaces between official narratives, from making things disappear so smoothly that nobody thinks to ask where they went. We're a problem they want to solve quietly, which gives us a narrow advantage. As long as we stay ahead of them, stay unpredictable, we can keep working. They abandoned their rental car in the parking lot and took an Uber to a different part of the city, paying cash for a room at a hostel under different fake names. Eleanor lay awake that night in an uncomfortable bunk bed, listening to Miles's breathing from across the room, wondering how many steps ahead their adversaries were. She thought about Sarah Mendez, about all the victims whose faces filled that manila folder, and about the fact that she and Miles might be adding their own names to that list before this was over. But she'd made her choice in that Queen's diner, and Eleanor Briggs had never been good at walking away from the truth, no matter the cost. By March, they had visited 3 more cities, and the pattern had evolved from disturbing to terrifying. In San Francisco, Marcus Chen's former colleagues at Nexus Technologies spoke in whispers about his concerns over a proprietary algorithm the company was developing for predictive surveillance. In Miami, Layla Johnson's supervisor at the community health clinic remembered her agitation over a group of patients who had been forcibly detained by what appeared to be federal agents, though no agency would claim responsibility. In Chicago, David Kowalski's fellow teachers recalled his plans to go public with evidence of a standardized testing scandal that implicated state education officials. Each victim had seen something they shouldn't have, known something that made them dangerous, and each had been erased with a precision that suggested institutional coordination. Eleanor and Miles had adapted to life on the run, never staying in one place more than 2 nights, using burner phones that they replaced weekly, paying for everything in cash, avoiding cameras when possible, and wearing generic clothing when they couldn't. They had become shadows moving through America's cities, hunting other shadows, aware that each question they asked drew them deeper into a web they didn't fully understand. The emotional toll was mounting. Eleanor found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, scrutinizing strangers for signs of surveillance, dreaming of vast conspiracies that dissolved into incoherence when she woke. Miles had withdrawn into himself, speaking less, drinking more, the weight of his past mistakes combining with the magnitude of what they were uncovering to create a darkness Eleanor could see consuming him. They were in a 24-hour diner in Dallas when Miles finally broke. It was 2 a.m, the place nearly empty except for a lone trucker and a waitress who looked like she'd seen every variation of human misery the night shift could offer. Eleanor was reviewing notes on Emma Rodriguez, the lawyer whose disappearance had been their Dallas focus, when Miles suddenly slammed his coffee cup down hard enough to crack the saucer. "This is impossible," he said, his voice raw. "We're collecting evidence that no one will ever believe, chasing victims we can't save, running from enemies we can't identify. What's the endgame here, Eleanor? What exactly do you think we're going to accomplish?" She looked up from her notes, seeing the desperation in his eyes. Miles Carter, the man who had once been unshakable in his convictions, was fracturing. "We expose the truth. We document everything we've found, and we take it public in a way they can't suppress. You're naive if you think any platform will touch this. Every major media outlet is owned by corporations with government contracts. Independent journalists who've tried to expose systemic corruption end up discredited, destroyed, or dead. We've seen what happens to people who get too close. Why do you think we're any different?" Eleanor set down her pen and met his gaze directly. "Because we don't have a choice, Miles. The moment we walked into this, we forfeited the luxury of giving up. These victims deserve someone who won't stop asking questions, who won't accept the convenient lies. And yeah, maybe we fail. Maybe we end up as 2 more names in a file somewhere, but at least we tried. At least we saw clearly what everyone else refuses to look at." "Noble sentiment," Miles said bitterly. "Tell me that when they're manufacturing evidence to discredit you, or worse. Tell me that when you're institutionalized like that Seattle journalist, pumped full of medications that make you question your own memories. You think you're strong enough to resist that? I've seen what they can do to people, Eleanor. I've watched careers destroyed, families torn apart, lives dismantled piece by piece until there's nothing left but doubt and grief." The waitress approached with a coffee pot, read the tension at their table, and retreated without a word. Eleanor waited until they were alone again before responding. "Then why are you here? If you're so convinced we'll fail, why did you come to me in the first place?" Miles was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Because Riverside destroyed me, and I needed to know if I was crazy, or if there really was something bigger happening. Because for 2 years, I've been piecing this together alone, and it was driving me insane. And because despite everything, despite the fear and the certainty that this ends badly, I can't let it go. I can't be the person who saw the pattern and did nothing." Eleanor reached across the table and gripped his hand, a gesture of solidarity she hadn't offered since their partnership had shattered. "Then we keep going. We're smarter than we were in Riverside. We know what we're up against now. And Miles, I need you functional, not drowning in whiskey and self-pity. These victims need us both at our best." He squeezed her hand briefly before pulling away. "You always were better at hope than I was." They returned their focus to Emma Rodriguez's case with renewed determination. Emma had been a civil rights attorney specializing in immigration cases, working for a non-profit that provided legal services to asylum seekers. According to her colleagues, she had been preparing a lawsuit against a private detention facility over conditions that potentially violated international human rights standards. She had been gathering testimonies, documenting abuses, building a case that could have forced government oversight of a system that operated largely in the shadows. 2 weeks before her scheduled court filing, she had vanished during her morning jog, her body never found, her evidence mysteriously corrupted on her office servers. The detention facility she was investigating is operated by Sentinel Solutions, a private security contractor, Miles said, pulling up information on his laptop. They run facilities in 6 states, all under government contracts that are classified under national security provisions. The company has former intelligence officials on its board, connections to defense contractors, and a legal team that has successfully fought every transparency request filed against them. Eleanor felt pieces clicking into place. Marcus Chen's company, Nexus Technologies, they developed surveillance algorithms. What if Sentinel Solutions is using that technology in their facilities? What if Marcus discovered that connection, and that's why he was targeted? Miles's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up corporate filings, board memberships, financial relationships. Nexus Technologies received a substantial investment from Stratus Capital Partners 18 months ago. Stratus also has significant holdings in Sentinel Solutions and 6 other private security firms. They're linked, Eleanor. These aren't random victims. They're all connected to a network of companies operating at the intersection of government power and private profit. The enormity of what they were uncovering settled over Eleanor like a physical weight. This wasn't just about individual disappearances. This was about a systematic operation to silence anyone who threatened a lucrative arrangement between government agencies and private contractors, a shadow system that existed beyond public scrutiny and constitutional constraints. "How many people have they disappeared?" she asked quietly. "The 5 we're tracking might just be the ones we found. There could be dozens more, hundreds maybe. Cases that never got enough attention to even make it into databases. People who were vulnerable, isolated, whose disappearances wouldn't generate sustained investigation." Miles closed his laptop and rubbed his eyes. "The question is, what do we do with this information? We can't exactly walk into a police station and lay this out. The moment we surface officially, we're compromised." Eleanor had been considering that problem for weeks now. Traditional channels were closed to them, but the 21st century offered alternatives that previous generations of whistleblowers hadn't possessed. We build an insurance file, everything we've gathered, all the connections, all the evidence, encrypted and distributed across multiple platforms with deadman switches. We make it so that if anything happens to us, the information goes public automatically. Then we reach out to the few journalists and activists we can trust, people who have the platforms and the courage to run with this story. You're talking about orchestrating a coordinated release across multiple independent outlets simultaneously, overwhelming their ability to suppress it through individual pressure. Miles nodded slowly. It could work, but it takes time to set up properly, and time is the one resource we're running short on. They're getting closer, Eleanor. I can feel it. The searches for us are getting more sophisticated, the near misses more frequent. As if to punctuate his point, Miles's laptop emitted a soft alert. He opened the monitoring program, and his face went pale. "We need to leave. Right now. Someone just accessed the hostel registration database in Portland and cross-referenced it with facial recognition data from traffic cameras along our route. They're building our movement pattern, backward engineering, where we've been to predict where we're going." They left cash on the table and walked quickly, but not obviously, to their car, another rental they'd picked up that afternoon. Eleanor forced herself to breathe normally, to not look around frantically for pursuers, to trust Miles's assessment of when they'd crossed from safe to exposed. Only when they were on the highway heading north did she allow herself to process the fear that had become her constant companion. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Days, maybe. We need to complete the insurance file now, tonight if possible. And Eleanor, we need to make a decision. When this goes public, when we trigger the release, our lives as we know them are over. We'll be permanent targets, always looking over our shoulders, never fully safe. Are you prepared for that?" She thought about her old life, the apartment she'd abandoned, the career she'd sacrificed, The relationships that had fallen away during her years of obsessive investigation. What did she have left to lose except the truth itself? I was prepared for it the moment I opened that folder in Queens. Let's finish this. They drove through the Texas night, the vast darkness of the American landscape stretching around them. Two people racing against an enemy they couldn't see to expose secrets that might cost them everything. Behind them, the invisible machinery of surveillance and suppression churned inexorably forward, and ahead lay a confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but whether the truth could still matter in a world that had learned to manufacture reality itself. The final pieces came together in an abandoned industrial building outside of Memphis, a city they'd chosen precisely because they had no connection to any of the cases there, a place where the pattern recognition algorithms tracking them might lose the thread. It was late April now, spring asserting itself across the American South with aggressive heat and the kind of humidity that made thinking difficult. Eleanor and Miles had spent 3 weeks building their insurance file, a digital monument to systematic corruption that incorporated encrypted documents, video testimonies, financial records, and narrative explanations that connected every dot they'd identified. The file was distributed across 37 separate servers, some legitimate cloud storage, others underground hosting services in countries with strong data protection laws. Deadman switches were set to trigger if either of them failed to input codes within specified time windows, and secondary triggers would activate if their biometric data indicated distress or incapacitation. They had also identified their targets for the coordinated release: 6 independent journalists with proven records of publishing controversial material, 3 civil liberties organizations with national reach, and 2 documentary filmmakers known for exposing government malfeasance. Each would receive partial access to the insurance file simultaneously, enough to verify its authenticity, but structured so that full understanding required collaboration, preventing any single point of suppression. Eleanor sat on a dusty concrete floor, her laptop balanced on her knees, reviewing the final narrative one more time. Months of investigation compressed into a document that read like a paranoid thriller, but was backed by evidence that met journalistic standards. Beside her, Miles was conducting final security checks, ensuring their communication channels were properly anonymized, that their physical location remained hidden from the digital dragnet that had been tightening around them. "We're ready," Miles said finally. "All recipients are queued up. The release sequence is programmed. All we need to do is hit send." Eleanor's finger hovered over the key, but something held her back. "Before we do this, I need to know something. Riverside, you said we were set up, that the evidence was manufactured. Tell me who did it. Tell me the truth." Miles set down his tablet and turned to face her, the weariness in his expression speaking to battles fought and lost. "I don't have absolute proof, but I've connected enough pieces to be certain. The Riverside case was about uncovering corruption in state contracts for prison management. We were getting close to exposing a network of kickbacks and bid rigging that implicated politicians from both parties. Someone decided we needed to be neutralized before we could publish our findings. The witness who recanted her testimony, the evidence that mysteriously disappeared, the internal affairs investigation that suddenly focused on us instead of the people we were investigating, all of it orchestrated by a private intelligence firm called Archon Security Group." "Archon?" Eleanor repeated, the name sounding familiar. She pulled up her files and found it. A subsidiary company of Stratus Capital Partners, the same investment group that linked Nexus Technologies and Sentinel Solutions. It's all the same network. The disappearances, Riverside, everything. They're a coordinated operation designed to protect a system of privatized government functions that operates outside democratic oversight. Exactly. And that's why this insurance file is so dangerous. We're not just exposing individual crimes or corrupt officials. We're revealing the architecture of an entire shadow system that has embedded itself into American governance. The moment we release this, we declare war on something much bigger than ourselves. Eleanor looked at the send button, understanding that the next few seconds would define the rest of her life, however long that might be. She thought about Sarah Mendez, about Marcus Chen and Layla Johnson and David Kowalski and Emma Rodriguez. She thought about all the unnamed victims who had been swallowed by this system, whose stories would never be told if someone didn't take the risk of telling them. Then let's declare war. She pressed send. The release sequence activated automatically, files dispersing through encrypted channels to their intended recipients. Within minutes, Eleanor's secondary monitoring showed that journalists were accessing the data, that organizations were mobilizing legal teams, that the information was beginning to propagate through networks designed to resist suppression. There was no taking it back now, no retreat into anonymity. They had become irreversible witnesses to a truth that powerful people had killed to conceal. How long before they realize what we've done? Eleanor asked. They probably already know. The question is how quickly they can respond and how effective that response will be. If we did this right, the information is spreading faster than they can contain it. Miles began packing their equipment. But we can't stay here. The moment we transmitted, we created a digital signature they can track. We have maybe an hour head start before tactical teams converge on this location. And they moved with practiced efficiency, wiping down surfaces, collecting every trace of their presence, becoming ghosts once more. But as they reached the building's exit, Miles stopped abruptly. "Wait! Listen!" Eleanor heard it then. The distant sound of helicopter rotors growing louder, multiple aircraft converging from different directions. They found us faster than you thought. Too fast. They must have had tracking devices we didn't detect, or maybe AI prediction models that narrowed our location despite our precautions. Miles pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. "I'm triggering the emergency protocols. Additional data dumps to backup channels, alerting our contacts that we're under imminent threat. If we don't make it out, at least the story survives." The helicopters were close now, and through the building's grimy windows, Eleanor could see black SUVs pulling into the parking lot, men in tactical gear deploying with military precision. Her heart hammered against her ribs, fear and adrenaline flooding her system. They were trapped, outmaneuvered by an adversary with resources they couldn't match. "The roof," Miles said. "There's a maintenance ladder leading to an adjacent building. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we have." They ran through the darkened building, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls, the sound of boots and commands growing behind them. Eleanor's lungs burned as they climbed the ladder, Miles ahead of her, pushing open a rusted hatch that led to the roof. The Memphis skyline sprawled before them, lights glittering in the warm evening air, ordinary life continuing oblivious to the drama unfolding in the industrial shadows. The jump to the adjacent building was wider than it had looked from below, maybe 8 feet across, with a 3-story drop to the alley beneath. Miles went first, his landing awkward but successful. Eleanor stood at the edge, vertigo making her head swim, the sounds of their pursuers emerging onto the roof behind her. There was no time for doubt or calculation. She jumped, Miles catching her as she landed, both of them stumbling but upright. They ran across rooftops, descending fire escapes, navigating the urban landscape with desperation, sharpening their reflexes. Behind them, the tactical teams adapted, coordinating their pursuit with professional efficiency. Eleanor understood with crystalline clarity that they were outmatched, that this chase would end eventually, that their luck would run out. But it didn't need to last forever. It just needed to last long enough for the story to spread beyond the point of containment. They emerged into a busy street, sirens wailing in the distance, civilians stopping to stare at the commotion. Miles pulled Eleanor into a crowded restaurant, using the density of people as temporary concealment. They moved through the kitchen, ignoring the protests of cooks and managers, and out a back exit into a maze of service alleys. Eleanor's phone buzzed with incoming messages. The first journalist had published a preliminary story based on their data. A civil liberties organization had filed emergency injunctions in federal court. Social media was beginning to pick up the thread, hashtags forming around the revealed information. The machine was in motion, the truth metastasizing through public consciousness faster than it could be killed. "It's working," Eleanor gasped, showing Miles the notifications. "People are paying attention. Then we've accomplished what we set out to do. Now we just have to survive long enough to see it through." Miles led them toward the Mississippi River, where the crowds were denser, where they might lose themselves in the anonymity of tourism and commerce. But as they reached the riverfront, Eleanor saw the trap closing. Black SUVs blocked the streets behind them. Tactical teams were positioned at strategic points around the plaza. Helicopters circled overhead, spotlights cutting through the gathering dusk. They had been herded here deliberately, channeled into a killing ground disguised as public space. Miles and Eleanor stood at the river's edge, tourists flowing around them like water around stones, everyone oblivious to the fact that they were witnessing the endgame of a months-long investigation into America's shadow systems. Eleanor thought about her parents, long dead, who had taught her that truth mattered more than safety. She thought about Miles beside her, a broken man who had found redemption in refusing to stop asking questions. She thought about Sarah and Marcus and Layla and David and Emma and all the others whose names she would never know. "No matter what happens next," she said to Miles, "thank you for trusting me with this, for giving me the chance to matter." "You always mattered, Eleanor. You just needed a story worth your talent." Miles squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture that contained everything they'd been through and everything left unsaid between them. The tactical teams were moving in now, slowly, carefully, aware that public witnesses complicated direct action. But they were coming nonetheless, the machinery of suppression making its final play to remove the thorns from its side. Eleanor's phone continued buzzing with notifications. More stories publishing, more lawsuits filing, more people awakening to the reality that had been hidden from them. A man in an expensive suit approached, flanked by security but projecting calm authority. Eleanor recognized the type, a fixer, someone sent to negotiate when violence would create more problems than it solved. "Ms. Briggs, Mr. Carter, I think we should have a conversation about how this situation can be resolved with minimal damage to everyone involved." "We've already said everything we need to say," Eleanor replied. "The world is listening now. You can't put this back in the box." "Perhaps not entirely," the man conceded, "but information is meaningless without credible sources to vouch for it. Discredited witnesses, people with histories of mental illness or criminal behavior, they're easy to dismiss. You'd be surprised how quickly a narrative can be reframed once the tellers are revealed to be unreliable." Miles laughed bitterly. "You're going to manufacture evidence against us, just like you did in Riverside. Make us look like conspiracy theorists or worse. But the documentation we've released speaks for itself. It doesn't need us to be credible." "True, but it helps. And the alternative to cooperation is considerably less pleasant. We're offering you a way out that doesn't end with you becoming cautionary tales." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Walk away now. Stop talking to journalists. Disappear quietly, and you get to keep your lives, if not your reputations." Eleanor looked out at the Mississippi River, its waters flowing endlessly toward the Gulf, carrying everything from the American heartland to the sea. She thought about how many stories these waters had witnessed, how many truths had been buried in its depths, how many people had chosen silence over the risks of speaking. She was so tired of running, of fear, of the constant calculation of threats and countermoves. Part of her wanted to accept the offer, to escape into anonymity and let others finish what they'd started. But that wasn't who Eleanor Briggs was. That had never been who she was. "No," she said simply, "we're not going anywhere. We're not recanting anything. And we're going to continue testifying to anyone who will listen about what we've found. You can try to discredit us, but the evidence stands on its own. You can try to silence us, but that only proves our point. So unless you're planning to disappear us right here in front of all these witnesses, I suggest you accept that you've lost this round." The man's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake that you'll regret for however long you have left." "Maybe," Miles said, "but at least it'll be a mistake we chose, not one imposed on us by people like you, who think power means never having to answer for what you do." The standoff stretched for a long moment, the plaza around them continuing its evening rhythms, street musicians playing, children chasing pigeons, couples walking hand in hand along the river, normal life proceeding while extraordinary things happened in its midst. Finally, the man in the suit gestured to his team, and they withdrew to the perimeter, watching but not advancing. Eleanor and Miles remained by the river as the sun set over Memphis, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the beauty of the moment incongruous with the darkness they'd been navigating. They stayed there as night fell, as the first television news programs began reporting on the leaked information, as social media exploded with debate and speculation, as the country began the slow process of reckoning with truths it had preferred not to see. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. "Lawsuits, investigations, congressional hearings if we're lucky, criminal prosecutions if we're very lucky, but also smear campaigns, intimidation, ongoing attempts to suppress and discredit. This doesn't end neatly, Eleanor. It just becomes a different kind of fight." Miles looked up at the darkening sky. "But at least it's a fight that's happening in the open now. That's more than we had a week ago." Eleanor pulled out her phone and began composing a message to the journalists they'd contacted, offering to provide on-the-record interviews, to testify publicly about everything they'd uncovered. If she was going to be a target anyway, she might as well make herself useful to the truth in whatever time remained. Beside her, Miles did the same. Two people who had lost everything except their commitment to believing that documentation and testimony and stubborn refusal to look away could still mean something in a world designed to make them meaningless. The next morning, their faces were on national news. By afternoon, they were trending on social media. Within a week, they were testifying before a congressional committee, their evidence corroborated by whistleblowers who had been waiting for someone to create an opening for truth. The machinery of accountability, slow and imperfect as it was, began to turn. Investigations were launched, executives resigned, politicians called for reforms. Nothing changed overnight, and much of the shadow system they'd exposed continued operating in modified forms, but cracks had appeared in the facade, and through those cracks, light was finally reaching places that had operated in darkness for too long. Eleanor and Miles never truly escaped the consequences of what they'd done. They lived under protection, their movements monitored by both people who wanted to kill them and people who wanted to keep them alive. They became symbols in a culture war they hadn't chosen, heroes to some and traitors to others. Their relationship, forged in crisis and sustained through shared purpose, evolved into something deeper than professional partnership, but more complicated than simple friendship. Two people bound together by understanding what it meant to see clearly and to pay the price for that vision. Years later, when the true crime documentaries and books began appearing, when their story was transformed into the kind of narrative that audiences consumed with fascination and horror, Eleanor reflected on whether it had been worth it. The victims they'd sought to honor remained dead or missing, their families still grieving. The systems they'd exposed had proven more resilient than hoped, adapting and continuing in altered forms. The America they'd wanted to protect felt more fractured and cynical than before. And yet, people knew now. The shadows had been illuminated, the machinery revealed, the lies exposed. She thought about Sarah Mendez sometimes, about the graphic designer who had noticed a pattern nobody else saw and had paid for that clarity with her life. She thought about the title she'd given to the case that had consumed her existence, the true crime cases that will haunt you forever. It had proven prophetic in ways she hadn't anticipated. These cases didn't haunt her because they were mysterious or sensational. They haunted her because they revealed an uncomfortable truth about the country she lived in, about the gap between the democracy people believed in and the reality of how power actually operated. But they also haunted her because they proved that individuals could still matter, that documentation and testimony and refusal to be silent could create ripples that became waves that eventually crashed against even the strongest walls. Some cases remained open, not because they lacked answers, but because closing them would require facing truths too painful to bear. Eleanor Briggs had chosen to bear those truths anyway, and in doing so had become part of a story that would indeed haunt America forever, not as a ghost of unsolved mystery, but as a testament to the cost of truth and the courage required to speak it. The sunset in Memphis continued to burn in her memory, that moment of choice when retreat was offered and refused, when two people decided that being right mattered more than being safe. It was the kind of moment that defined lives, that separated those who witnessed injustice from those who confronted it. And though the years that followed brought pain and compromise and the slow erosion of hope that accompanies extended contact with institutional inertia, that moment remained pure, a reminder that once, when it mattered most, Eleanor Briggs had chosen truth over comfort, documentation over denial, and the possibility of change over the certainty of complicity. The cases would haunt America forever, but more importantly, so would the people who refused to let them be forgotten.